It's October 2008. This is Maximize Utility. Today I want to do one of a series of what I call Jargon, the Maximize Utility Efficient Markets Repertoire. And I want to teach you some terms, mostly from economics, but also from related business, that I think are really cool, and you can use them in a variety of ways to impress people. And just for contrast, from physics you get a lot of terms like Big Bang and Heisenberg uncertainty, and everything is relative, and Back to the Future. You hear these all the time. Back to the Future, for example, is the title of a movie. Sound really good sometimes, but I think the stuff from economics can outclass that physics stuff 10 to 1. And I'll give you some examples, and then I'll show you how to use them, and how to use them to impress people like your parents, and to do well in job interviews. I'll give you some specific examples. And to do things like the way I put it is pick up broads or impress members of the other sex. I say pick up broads because I'm a man and I don't know much about picking up men. I'll leave that to somebody else. Jargon is, we say, factored in. You can also say discounted or shrugged off. And these terms are heard primarily in investing and in financial markets, but are becoming more commonplace in discussions of other aspects of life. In financial markets, when an ostensibly important piece of news is reported on a company or a market sector, and nothing significant happens to the company's stock price or the market sector, we say the news was factored in or discounted. So, for example, a large monetary award is made against a company by a court, but the company's stock does not go down. Or a big hurricane hits, yet insurance company stocks do not go down. Or a war breaks out, but the price of gold does not go up. Or the Fed lowers the interest rate, but the market does not move. These events are, we say, shrugged off, because the market's already factored in the probabilities of such events. The joke goes, the market did not move today with the news of the Martian invasion. It was factored in, the analyst said. So here are some examples. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attack was definitely not factored in. After that attack, stock prices went way down, people reevaluated risk, and a whole host of other things happened. People had not figured on such an event. But here's an example of something I think that was factored in, even if the popular media didn't believe so. If you remember back in 2003, there was a presidential candidate, Howard Dean, who was doing very well, and then he made a remark that he wanted the votes of Southern males who had Confederate flags in the back of their pickup truck, something like that. Now, everybody said that this ruined his candidacy to some extent, but my guess is that that was probably factored in, that people expect that candidates who are hot, who are making a lot of appearances, will say a flippant thing or two, and that the reason Dean's candidacy was declining was that he probably wasn't as popular as he was reported to be in the first place, and he was just declining anyway. Here's another example of something that's completely factored in, even though, as you'll see, it represents 40,000 people dying compared to only 3,000 people dying in the September 11, 2000 terrorist attack. So the article is, Highway Debts Highest Since 1990. It was an AP piece. I saw it on Boston.com a couple of years ago. And the reality is that every year in America, 40-odd thousand people die in car accidents, even if it goes up from 42,000 to 43,000. That's something we shrug off. It's factored in. It's not going to change the price of stocks for auto companies or anything related to driving. It's discounted. We know about it, and in a sense we don't care about it, or we figured it into the way we live our lives. Information set. As in, how does this change my information set? So let's say you're in the office and people are talking about the death penalty, and somebody says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth makes the world blind and toothless. Or then maybe later on the topic of conversation goes to terrorism, and somebody says, the key to fighting terrorism is to capture Osama bin Laden. Now, how would those pieces of information change what you really know about those issues? Not at all. An economist would say, that does not change my information set, so I shouldn't act on it. So, in the early 2000s, everybody observed the price of houses was going up, and we both talking about a housing bubble this, housing bubble that. Now, by 2007, we had identified the culprit, or one of the culprits, as the subprime part of the market. But somewhere in between, people were tipping us off to this subprime market and what was wrong with it. That should have changed your information set. Now, here's an example that you can probably relate to if you know a little bit about sports. After the close football game, in which the quarterback was taken out in a stretcher, but the team was able to pull off a win with an interception with seconds left on the clock as the other team was threatening, the coach is interviewed. He comes out and he says, our D really came through again. Then later on he's asked a question, and he says something like this. He says, I'm not sure about what will happen next week with the quarterback, but I did get some reports that he might have torn his rotator cuff. Now, that first statement isn't going to change your information at all. But that second statement should make you rush to the phone to put a bet in. If we know something that about the quarterback, that his rotator cuff, which is the thing that makes his arm turn around so he can throw the ball, if there's something wrong with that, that might be the end of his career. That should change your information set. Off by a factor. And when we say this without qualification, we mean off by a factor of 10. You can also talk about being off by a factor of 2, or off by a factor of 72, whatever you like, but without specifying, you mean off by a factor of 10. So it's really a million, not 100,000, or really 100,000, not a million, depending which way you're going. And you see this all the time. It's just a fancy way of describing exaggeration. So you had a friend, he says he had to wait 2 hours for something. You suspect it was more like 50 minutes. He's off by a factor. And another friend boasts he made tens of thousands of dollars trading options in the last few months, but he has trouble paying for lunch. You suspect that he's off by a factor. And you see this all the time in the newspapers. For example, I read an article in the Boston Globe back in December 2003 informing us of cutters. These are young people who cut their own bodies out of despair in high schools. And at one high school, it was reported that 1/3 of the young women there were such cutters. Now my guess is that that was off by a factor times a factor, that it wasn't 1/3, and it wasn't 1/30th, it was probably more like 1/300th. The school system in question was Weymouth, which is adjacent to Hingham, where my son was a student at Hingham High School at that time, and I asked him, and he knew nobody who cut their bodies. Anyway, you see this very commonly with crowd counts. In Boston every year we have what's called First Night, and the Boston Globe routinely reports that the turnout is 1 million or more. 1.6 million was the number back in 2004, and they always report it as over 1 million. My guess is that at First Night in Boston, there's probably something more like 100,000 people, not 1 million. And you also see this sometimes in time frames. People will say they've been saying something for months, a prediction perhaps, and they've been wrong, but it's finally happening. But they've really been saying it for years. So their prediction has been wrong for a long time. And I think you also see it a lot in partisan debates and causes. And one more area, you see a lot of historical numbers. Things that were reported long, long ago, like a disaster that killed 100,000 people. It might more likely have been 10,000 people. So say off by a factor when you suspect that somebody's exaggerating in a large way, and you want to say something more clever than just, hey, you're exaggerating. Basis point. A basis point is 1/100th of a percentage point. So, for example, if you're getting a car loan and it's 7.5%, that would be 750 basis points. You wouldn't really say that quite. We use it more so for changes in interest rates or for spreads between different kinds of interest rates. You might look at the rates for high-yield bonds versus U.S. Treasuries, and you talk the spread is 300 basis points or 700 basis points. And you might say something like, oh, the Fed lowered the Fed funds target rate and they lowered by 50 basis points. That would be 0.5%. You use it right, and it sounds really good. You use it incorrectly, and you can look really pretentious. Okay, so let's look at some examples of this MU and EM jargon in action. I'll act out little skits. Fact it in. Let's say you're doing a job interview at some financial services company, and they ask you about Fed policy. You sit there and you say something like, well, you know, I think 25 basis point cut is already factored in by the market, blah, blah, blah. That sound really good? How about information set? Now, let's say you and your girlfriend spent the other night watching the debate between the vice presidential candidates, Sarah Palin and Joe Biden, and she's all interested in the election because it involves a woman. But you stand there and you say, oh, come on, I didn't see anything in that debate that changed my information set. That might sound really good. How about off by a factor? Now, let's say over the years, as you've gotten older, you've developed a kind of rivalry with your parents. There's a generational gap or something like that. They're great readers of the Boston Globe. They're old school. Say, oh, come on, Dad. You know everything in that newspaper is off by a factor. How about basis point? Let's go back to a job interview here. Again, financial services job perhaps. And they're asking you a question. Oh, is there anything else you might like to tell us about some activity that you've been involved in? You say, yeah, well, you know, my parents got a mortgage a couple of years ago, and I made a deal with them that if I could help them refi, they'd whatever reward me. And I watched rates for a long time, and eventually I was able to refi their mortgage 75 basis points less than the original mortgage they had. That would sound really good.